Bueno, ahora sí, para darle curso a esta tarde, a esta jornada, vamos a empezar con el bloque de transformación digital. A esta hora le vamos a dar la bienvenida a Daniel Martínez, Managing Director de BCG X, con la conferencia What GenAI to Perform de Differently. Así que queremos darle la bienvenida a Daniel, que hoy nos acompaña para abrir la jornada de la tarde. Bienvenido.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Ok, buenas tardes, o buen día, no, buenas tardes. Mira, no voy a poder hablar en español porque si no van a me molestar, me dijeron para hacerlo en inglés. Ok, entonces, good afternoon. My name is Dan Martinez. I'm a managing director with BCG X, which is the artificial intelligence arm of BCG. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Andy, for having me. So today I'll talk about three things. The first one is, what is generative AI? I'm going to avoid, skip a little bit of the introduction of what it is, but I'll talk a little bit about it. But we'll get into where GenAI is going. And then second, we'll talk about how companies are adopting this. Generative AI is going viral across sectors of the industry. How are companies adopting it? And then last, what are companies doing differently with generative AI? So generative AI started I'd say, in bulk, November of 2022, and it became viral across companies, right? It became viral into our day-to-day. It became viral into how we do work every day and using these technologies, not just in our lives, but also at work. So when we think about what are these models, right? Still a lot of people are thinking about what is AI? What are these models? What do they mean? What do they do? How are they trained? And a lot of people think about, right, these models, they have a lot of data that is used to train these models. So think of terabytes and terabytes of data. Think of all the books, manuals, specifications, product recommendations, videos, images, music. All of this type of data is trained into these models. And then these models become very large, right? So the only companies that have these models, if you think about this circle in the middle, think of it as ChatGPT, for example, right? So the companies like OpenAI or Google or Amazon, they're all creating models. Creating these models takes a long time, takes over a year to build these models. Usually, every time you need to train these models, it takes about 3 weeks, and every training round costs about $100 million. So that's why to build one of these models, it's a $1 billion investment. And if you think about companies like Microsoft, they put in $11 billion on OpenAI to build these models. Amazon is putting $4 billion on Anthropic to build these models. Again, these are large multi-year investments. And then once you have these models, you can do very interesting things, right? So you can summarize text, you can create new text, you can now generate videos, you can now generate movies, right? So very interesting things that have implications in work, companies, economy, society, how we develop society. It will have implications on education, healthcare, so I'll talk a little bit more about that. But AI in of itself is not a new technology. It's been around for over 50 years. And if you think about, it started with rules-based type technologies, then machine learning, and then deep learning, right? So having multiple layers of machine learning so you can learn multiple topics. And now there's a whole race around building bigger models, models that are more capable of doing things, more general models, right? Including models that can do coding. Like we don't think about, the fact that this is a technology that can actually build itself, right? So the fact that these models can do coding means they can self-regenerate, which is something we're going to start to see happening. So now there's a race for models, and you can see that the main technology companies investing billions of dollars to build these models. But in 2017, I just wanted to call out because 2017, Google wrote a public paper called Attention is All You Need. And in that paper, they described the new technology called Transformer. Transformer is the T in ChatGPT. And the Transformer is the new AI technology that is very good at processing a lot of data, understand what question the user is asking, and then creating a response. And what happened is OpenAI read the paper and they said, interesting, let's build a model. And in 2022, off we go, ChatGPT. And then Google found themselves in a difficult position to say, well, now we have to catch up and we have to build a ChatGPT type tool very fast. And they launched Bard, they launched Gemini, right? So they continue to evolve. But ChatGPT, they gain distribution. ChatGPT today has about 400 million users per month. Right? Google has, to give an idea, Google search has 1.5 billion users per month, which they accumulated over many years. So ChatGPT became overnight a sensation, the most successful product ever invented. But if we look at last week or last 2 weeks alone, right, we've seen OpenAI launched ChatGPT 4.0 for Omni with new vision and voice capabilities. We've seen Google launch a whole number of new innovations, including the new Trillium chip, the Project Astra for agents, the VO video engine, and much more. And then Microsoft launched Copilot for PC. So now generative AI tools are coming to your desktop. So they are able to see and monitor everything that you're doing. It's coming to the computer, right? That's a new type of innovation. All of this happened in the last 2 weeks. So the race continues. But how do we think about traditional AI versus generative AI? And if you think about traditional data science was very good at being deterministic, right? I can do personalization, I can do product optimization, I can do pricing, I can do forecast, very discrete tasks. I can ask one thing and it answers that thing really well. And then we've seen an evolution in machine learning, deep learning neural networks with applications like Alexa, for example. So Alexa, you can ask anything, but Alexa only responds with the skills that it's been trained on, right? Whether it's playing music or whether it's helping you with a shopping list. With ChatGPT, with generative AI, you can now ask anything and you can answer anything. Again, because the amount of data that these models are trained on, they have the concept of general knowledge. But what are some of the challenges for this technology? One of them is not just compute power or GPU power, or the GPU chip, which is the infrastructure these models require to run on, but they also consume a lot of energy. And if you think about search, so Google search, for example, every time you use ChatGPT, you're consuming 30 times more energy than if you're consuming search. So what are these companies doing to address that point, right? There's going to be a shortage of energy. There's already a shortage of energy, and how do these companies address this point? Well, they're investing in nuclear. So Sam Altman backed a startup, Oklo, that's a nuclear power startup. Google is investing in geothermal energy. Amazon buys a nuclear power data center. Microsoft is investing $100 billion to build a data center. And if you look at the press release from NVIDIA, the earnings release from NVIDIA last week, they reported a growth in sales of 262%. And those are sales of GPU chips. But these are the old GPU chips, right? These are the Hopper model. They also announced that they have a GPU chip that's 4 times more powerful, 4 times more higher performance, called Blackwell, right? So NVIDIA is also investing in this. NVIDIA, by the way, they are more valuable now than Amazon and Tesla combined because of this announcement last week. So just think that one of the things that's a bit hidden in the announcement from the CEO at NVIDIA last week was that they're now building data centers 100% dedicated to artificial intelligence. So just think about that for a moment, right? The workloads that we have in cloud today, very quickly they're going to move to AI-only workloads. And Google has been doing this for a while, but now they're building these data centers for Microsoft, for Amazon, and other tech companies. So energy in of itself is going to be a point of discussion, not just from investments in energy, but also sustainability. But how do we, again, think about AI, right? So we think about AI not just, right, when we think about traditional AI, we think of it as a tool, right? You ask one thing, it answers one thing, and it does that really well. But now we're going to start to think about AI as a worker, right? Because not just you can ask anything and it can do anything, but it can also plan tasks and it can execute tasks. It can orchestrate these models. So we're starting to have conversations with academia around the concept of AI agents, okay? And we're starting to build these agents for companies. So I'm going to give you some examples of what these agents look like. And last year, there was a piece of research that was actually, it went mostly unnoticed. It was research from Stanford and Google, where they talk about a society of agents. And the research, I mean, I'll just give you a little bit of a quick introduction. So they created a gaming platform, and they created 25 agents. And they populated this scenario with 25 agents. They gave some prompt engineering to instantiate these agents. And they started to demonstrate emergent social behaviors. So they organized in parties, they organized events, they were able to interact with each other, they formed alliances, right? So again, just think of these agents are not, this is not what we see in traditional AI. These agents are demonstrating behavior, they're demonstrating intent, they're demonstrating the ability to complete tasks, to self-organize. And one of the things that we're having conversations with organizations now, as they think about adopting this technology, it's not about solving yesterday's problems with generative AI. We need to think about how do we solve future problems with generative AI. So let's talk about a few examples. The first one is, how do we even think about bringing this to organizations in society? So one of the ways that BCG approaches this with clients is, okay, well, so the first path to get started is, okay, let's give this to our employees and see how they're using it. Because one of the things that people are still learning is, what is AI, right? How do I think about data? How do I think about technology, right? So it's going to require the business to gain AI literacy and data literacy, right? So giving ChatGPT to employees is one way to achieve that, right? So we're starting to see companies buy licenses of ChatGPT Enterprise, give to employees, allow them to train to learn by using it. And you know, one of the biggest concerns last year from this is, how do I keep my data private? So Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, they launched private instances of all these models. So now enterprises can take this model, they freeze the model, you put this in your own private cloud, and then employees can use it. So that's what we call deploy. The second one is reshape, right? So once the employees are using it, now let's take a step back and how is my marketing going to be different with GenAI? How is my customer service going to be different? My finance function, my HR, my business operations, right? Sales, for example. So companies are now starting to rethink how to orchestrate their business processes using GenAI at the core, right? So that's what we call reshape. And then the last one, companies are starting to think about, what can I do with this excess productivity? I can innovate. I can expand into other markets, right? So it becomes, so lots of new interesting opportunities for companies once you solve for the first two. Now, if we look across sectors, GenAI is already here. It's real. Companies are already building on top of it. Okay? This is not something that's going to happen in the next 5 years. This is something that's happening now. So let me give you a little bit of a panorama of what's happening across sectors. In healthcare, for example, we're going to see new drugs being developed by AI. There is a medication right now for pulmonary fibrosis. It's in phase 2 clinical trial. We're going to see the results coming this year or next year. It's going to be the first AI drug ever invented by artificial intelligence. And it was invented in 21 days versus something that takes months to invent. And then when we take a step back and we look at the pipeline of treatments from biotech, right, companies that use AI to generate new drugs, the pipeline is much bigger than the pipeline of traditional pharmaceutical companies that we're all used to, like Merck, Pfizer, Sanofi, for example, right? So the pipeline is much bigger. And then in our research within BCG, we learned that not just the pipeline is bigger, but then the success rate in phase 1 clinical trials is 80 to 90%. That's higher than the average of traditional pharma companies, which is 40%. So healthcare is a sector that's already being impacted. We're seeing the emergence and proliferation of doctor assistants, right? So these are agents that can record the patient visit and it can transcribe in a medically compliant way. So this is something that's already happening in the United States. There are thousands of doctors already using this technology and so on. And the idea is to reduce the burden, right, the burnout in doctors and nurses, which is chronic today. When I look into the financial sector, many banks are already implementing customer service chatbots. And we have, BCG alone, we have about 50 projects with banks all over the world implementing these chatbots. We're finding a lot of success in productivity. We're finding success in decreased error rates. And then customers are happier when they actually talk to a chatbot versus talking to a human, because you can configure the chatbot to be polite 100% of the time. Okay, versus humans, sometimes you have a bad day. In the industry and manufacturing, we're seeing the emergence of technician co-pilots. And I'll talk about one of the examples soon. And technician co-pilots are co-pilots that allow engineers to be more effective in the field, right? So they don't have to now browse thousands of documents and equipment specifications. They have this at their fingertips, and they have an assistant that can help them. And many others. We're starting to see, for example, applications in education. In fact, there are two of the sectors that we see being most disrupted by generative AI is education and healthcare. So in education, we've seen the emergence of AI tutors, like, for example, the Camigo from Khan Academy. It's still experimental. Companies are still testing with it. There's a lot of discussion about what does this mean for education? Is this going to create more inequality, or is it going to close the inequality gap? Remains to be seen. But schools and school systems are thinking about, how do I use this to tutor my students? How do I use this to evaluate and assess my students? Right? Because now you can actually, once a student finishes their exam, you can take a picture and you can get an instant grade. And you can get personalized feedback on how you did in the exam. And then the last one is, how do you use this to help students find a job, or go through like a vocational training and help them navigate the workforce, which is also a big gap. So let's go through a couple of examples. The first one is, this is an energy company in the United States. It's a solar-powered company, and they have 2,000 engineers who are working in the field, doing maintenance across lots of equipments that of various different levels of complexity, equipments that sometimes are really old and 10, 20, 30, 40 years old equipment. And then they depend on manuals to go and fix these equipment. Sometimes you have junior engineers that they don't understand how to fix and provide and do maintenance. So we built a technician co-pilot trained on equipment specifications, and we found that engineers are 10% more productive. But most important, and again, productivity is not the only way to measure the impact of GenAI. We also see a decrease in error rates and an increase in asset uptime. So now we have about 400 engineers using it. And again, we need to think about the impact on morale, impact on NPS scores, right? The acceptance of these tools becomes immediate, very high. And again, it's avoiding them, it's preventing them from having to look at hundreds of documents, PDF documents that sometimes are really old. So again, think of this as an assistant, not as a tool. The second one is an Asian bank where they built a financial co-pilot to look into the customer accounts. Like if you think in banking, one of the biggest challenges in banking is having a 360 view of the customer. So now you can take all that data into a generative AI model, and you can have something that's much more intelligent and able to summarize the relationship with the customer, how to think about personalizing the customer relationship, and then how do you improve your product offerings to these customers. And as part of doing that, you also help increase financial literacy, which is a problem for underbanking populations. And then the last one is something, it's public, we built with L'Oreal, which is a beauty assistant. And less popular with men, but I'm sure it's going to be popular with women. So this is something that not only you can take a picture of your skin, it detects what skin you have, it recommends products, but then you can even personalize. So for example, if you're going to a dinner and you can say, it's going to be outside, it's going to be humid, so what is the right product for my skin for this scenario, right? So it's able to really personalize. And in general, personalization is a big topic for generative AI. It's something that companies are starting to really think about exploring. Because if you think about traditional AI, the way it thinks about personalization is very coarse-grained, right? So it thinks about class, it thinks about level of wealth, level of education, is a man or woman, right? So it's very coarse grained. Now with generative AI, we can have sort of what we think the personalization of one. Okay? So when we think about going back to sectors across the economy, most of our enterprises fall into 4 buckets. And I'll actually start with the far left. On the left, you have the tech companies. These companies are playing to win. They're investing billions of dollars. They're building data centers. They're building models. They are attracting a lot of talent. So these companies are, again, it's a category apart. But if you look across the broader sectors of the economy, we still have a lot of companies, 40% of them, who still have sort of a defensive stance. And what that means is they're sort of wait and see mode and thinking about, having the conversation, thinking about the use cases. Where do I start with this? How do I partner with technology companies? Many companies are dependent on large ERP systems, like, for example, SAP or Oracle. So they're waiting for these large companies to provide a generative AI answer to their problems, right? So lots of companies are still in this wait and see mode, educating, thinking about use cases. Most of our clients are following this piloting buckets, right? So last year, if you think about, if I draw a panorama, if you think about 2023 was this year of lots of experimentation. And lots of organizations developed proofs of concepts, prototypes, early pilots, and now they're sitting on lots of POCs and they're like, how do I scale this? In 2024, it's going to be a lot more about what's the value of this? How do I get to value? And last year, a lot of teams from IT, for example, from technology teams, data science teams, building all of these POCs. This year, it's going to be much more about the business. How do I roll this out? How do I scale? How do I put this in front of my employees, for example, right? So all of these companies, the majority of the companies that we're starting to see growth in piloting. And then there's like a few companies who are saying, look, enterprise AI is going to be everywhere. AI is going to be across all of our business processes. It's going to be part of our value chain, and we need to make a big bet. And these companies are investing about $50 to $100 million a year to implement GenAI across their entire value chain, from sales to production to servicing to internal functions, and they're developing a strategy that's broad across the enterprise. And we see companies in oil and gas doing this. We see companies in healthcare doing this. We see banks doing this, right? But it's a minority of companies who are willing to make a bet and be early adopters. The challenge with companies that are fast followers or early adopters is that this technology is still new, right? So I'll talk a little bit more about where this technology is going, but there's still a lot of figuring out. Companies that are implementing GenAI now, they're dealing with data problems, they're dealing with lack of talent, they're dealing with platforms that are not fully mature. So it's a big challenge for companies today, and that's why we see a lot of enterprises, large enterprises, still waiting for platforms to mature a bit more before they get on this journey. So what are the top performers doing differently? Right? So at BCG, we have about close to 400 projects today globally where we're implementing GenAI, or we're developing a strategy, or we're helping companies launch use cases. So 5 things that companies are doing differently. So one of them is they're thinking about, look, last year I did a lot of POCs, but they're not scaling. So what do I do with them? How do I get value from generative AI? And a lot of the POCs last year were around knowledge management, right? So answering questions from my employees, right? Which is a good start to help build the muscle, build the learning curve, help you think about your data, and so on, but it doesn't really change the company. So how do we think about investing in top-line growth, productivity growth? How do we think about morale of the employee? How do we think about solving for quality issues? How do we think about reducing errors, right? So thinking through what value you want out of generative AI is now the focus for this year and next year. The second thing that people realize is that they put ChatGPT or these tools in front of employees, and sometimes employees are using for search or other reasons, right? So again, not everybody understands what AI is, and that's fine, right? This is where the maturity of organizations are. So educating employees all the way from leadership to junior levels is important. And if I can give an example, there's a pharmaceutical called Moderna. They have a CEO mandate to train 100% of their employees on generative AI. And they partnered with universities like Harvard to produce a curriculum for leadership and their employees, right? So companies are making a big bet into building data literacy, building AI literacy, data literacy, and technology literacy, right? This is really important to understand this technology well. Because part of the challenge is the generative AI to implement and get it right, it may end up being more expensive than traditional AI, so companies need to be very intentional how they're using it. The third one is about cost. So there are new cost items that companies need to be mindful of. So every time you use these models, right, you incur a inference cost. Inference is the use of these models. So every time you ask a question, you're executing an inference, there's a token cost. If you ask a question that has a ton of text in it, that question has to be interpreted by the model, and then it has to be responded by the model. So there's a token cost on the question, there's a token cost on the answer. Right? So, you know, interestingly, Google launched a model that has a million token context window. That means you can put the entire Harry Potter collection into a Gemini model and ask a question on it. But that means also you're incurring a large token cost on the question. Okay? So companies need to be mindful exactly how do they think about cost. Companies are also finding there's a lot of cost around data. Because what happens is, you know, the way I think about these models, like AI model is the engine of GenAI, data is the fuel that goes into that engine. So if companies have bad data, the engine is not going to work well. And then you still have to build a whole platform around these models. You have to train these models. You have to control how they behave. These models still hallucinate. So there's lots of costs around building the engine, training the engine, but then building the car as well. Or companies are forming alliances with technology companies, right? Because this space is evolving faster than anything we've ever seen. The technology companies are investing to stay ahead. So staying close to companies like Microsoft or Amazon, Intel, NVIDIA will help companies adopt this technology in a safer way and get access to talent that's hard to get otherwise. And then I'll talk a little bit about responsible AI and what the risks are. So when we think about the opportunities, right, so starting with opportunities, we did a study last year across sectors of the economy, so if you can see the verticals of the economy, and then what are the functions within those verticals and how they're going to be impacted. And we're starting to see what are the high impact areas in certain functions. So for example, media and marketing is an area that's going to be highly impacted. It's already being impacted today. So we're starting to see, for example, these models, they are multimodal, so they can generate marketing content, they can generate marketing videos, they can generate images. So companies are like, how do I work with my agency now? What is my agency doing? So even the agencies will have to think about how do they adopt this technology and become more efficient, right? So now, even when companies go to marketing agencies, they can go to these agencies with a much more well-developed content saying, this is exactly what I need. And then we're also starting to see in marketing companies that literally generate content, they generate campaigns, they push these campaigns to social media, they measure which ones are successful, they measure which ones are not successful, and then they train their models on the ones that are not successful. I mean, they train their models on both of them, which ones to do and which ones to not do going forward. The next campaign is going to become much more efficient, right? So again, think of this technology as this is something that learns over time, becomes better over time, and we're going to see these models grow a lot, right? So if you think about these models today, even though they're large, right, comparatively speaking, these models are about 1 trillion parameters in size compared to traditional AI models, which are about 10,000 parameters in size. But in 5 years, we're going to see models that are 100 times bigger, right? And this is exactly what the tech companies are building at the moment, right? So this is a snapshot of where GenAI is having an impact in the industry today. We expect GenAI to continue to have a bigger impact. So this picture will continue to change as we go along. But when we think about the upscaling, again, it's not just building the models, right? So again, the 10%, you know, BCG, we have this 10, 20, 70 approach where 10% again is the engine of the car, 20% is tech and data. So think about the car and the fuel, but then you still have to train people to drive the car and get to a destination. That's when you unlock value for organizations. So one of the things that leaders are all having discussions at the board level, at the executive leadership team is what is going to be the impact in our employees. And there's a ton of fear discussion around what's the future of work, what's going to happen to employees. I mean, in general, and we at BCG, we don't have a position one way or another. I mean, we're still learning. We're all together with our clients. We're still learning how this is manifesting within companies. But every technology to date has increased productivity, and it resulted in people having to work more. So one of the ways that this can have an impact in work is, yes, increase productivity, but also this will increase demand on the workers. So we need to manage that, and how do we manage that change in organizations? It's a ton of work. And even if you think about traditional AI, they had, again, very specific use case. They were built by data scientists. The users are usually one or two of, a forecasting model, a pricing model, right? Now it's the entire company. Generative AI is going to impact the entire company, right? So change management for GenAI becomes much more important than change management for traditional AI. And then as we think about the cost item, right? So energy costs will likely go up for a short period at a minimum. And if you think about, just comparatively speaking, Microsoft, AWS, Alphabet, and Meta, when they were building their models back in 2022, they spent more energy that year than the entire country of Colombia. Okay? So just think about that for a minute. We're talking about a handful of companies, right? But the energy consumption, again, it's 30 times bigger than the energy consumption of search, right? Not just building these models, but then using these models as well, right? So let's just be mindful of that. There's a reason why these companies are investing so heavily in nuclear power. And they're also forming alliances with energy companies, right? So think of Microsoft, Brookfield, Alphabet with SIP as they think about, how do I think about sustainability of AI going forward? And by the way, this is robbing energy from other areas and sectors of the economy that's going to create conflict that companies will have to manage. The investments are very large, right? So they are in the billions of dollars, right? So think of Alphabet investing in AI-first data centers. That's just this year, okay? So that's just the first quarter of this year, right? These investments, we expect them to continue. And then as we think about partnerships, right? These companies are becoming, again, they were already powerful in the cloud world, right? They're going to continue to become very powerful in the generative AI world. And the reason why companies have to go through them, well, first of all, you have to get access to models, right? So when you think about models, we actually did a research late last year, and we found out that there's about 600,000 models already available, okay? A lot of them are models that we're never going to use. A lot of these are like very specialized, fine-tuned models. But then, so the options really are, at this point, for large enterprises with complex requirements, you're either going with Google and Gemini, or Amazon and Anthropic, or Azure and OpenAI. And then there's like a few open source models like Llama 3 built by Meta that they're partnering with a couple of open source platforms. I'd say for large enterprises, these are the models of choice that we see 90% of our clients using. And these models are not just because they're great and they can do a lot of interesting things, but they also have the best guardrails, right? So they are also the ones that best manage risk. They are the ones that have fewer copyright risks. It's not zero, but they do have very good controls in place, and they have teams monitoring them. So access to models is one example. Data protection. All of these companies, they offer private access to these models. And if you think about a major risk last year was data protection, right? Data privacy. And we've seen companies like Samsung, for example, they put in public data, they put in their private data into the public model. And not just public data, but they put in like code. In particular, Samsung, they put in a code from one of their production lines, a code that manages the quality of their manufacturing line. So data protection is another big issue that was addressed last year. Access to expertise, right? So when you work with these companies, you have access to their machine learning engineers, which is critical, right? These people are the forefront of building models and making them safe, and then to accelerate value. So let's maybe talk a little bit about risks of these models, right? Of this technology. I'm not going to drain this page, but let me touch on a couple of them. Many people are aware that these models hallucinate, right? So that means they do things that they weren't trained for. So when you put these models in front of your customers, right, you need to be mindful that they may answer questions that are incorrect, right? Where I actually met with the VP of AI of a pharmaceutical company, and he was saying we need to get used to living in a world of bad software that misbehaves, right? This is part of the future in a way. So I'm not sure if I'm convinced about that, but it's something to be mindful of, right? The outputs are very biased, right? I heard somewhere that 70% of the data that is used to train these models came from white male sources, right? And now there's new research coming from Harvard. We're going to see in the coming months. It's not public yet. That they looked at these models, and when you ask a question to these models, right? So when you submit a prompt, what these models do is when they interpret these questions, they activate a certain space in the matrix. I mean, it is actually a matrix, not the movie Matrix, but it's actually a matrix. And when in the space that gets activated, we can actually introspect into that space. And in that space, what the model is doing is it's trying to understand who you are. And it's trying to understand, and we're actually able to probabilistically say 80% of chance that this person is above 40, 70% chance that this person is male, 50% chance that this person is of this socioeconomic class, right? We can define a number of criteria on how these models are modeling you, okay? So just think that these models are very biased, and they are a black box, right? So when we think about if you use a closed source model like OpenAI or Anthropic or Gemini, we can't really understand how they're modeling us, right? We can only do this in open source models. So we just need to be mindful that and continues to do testing for bias before we put this in front of customers. We're also going to see more sophisticated phishing attacks. That's already happening. So just think that in your email, for example, if you use Gmail, Google uses AI to detect spam. But now that spam is generated by AI, by generative AI, they become much more sophisticated. And the traditional AI tools that were used to detect these spam emails, they're failing. And a lot of chief information security officers are really concerned about this. And a lot of banks are seeing, for example, the rising cost of fraud. Okay? So some new issues are coming with this technology, deep fakes, for example. We were doing a conference last week in Portugal, and we created a deep fake in 5 minutes for one of our leaders, right? So just think that if your voice is public, if your voice is in the public, it can be copied, it can be trained into an AI model, and then people can create a video of you, okay? So that's already happening. We're also going to see copyright issues. We've seen a number of lawsuits from companies like New York Times or Getty Images, right? Suing companies like OpenAI for using public data to train their models. So that will continue. And we're starting to see Microsoft paying royalties to content providers, right? Just like Spotify pays royalties to musicians, we're going to see model builders paying royalties to content providers as well. We also see the European Union AI Act, right? So that's a new regulation that was passed in Parliament. This regulation is going to be turned into law in 2027. By the way, by 2027, we're going to be in a whole different world. We'll see how effective is the regulation. But it's telling us like areas that we cannot use AI. For example, we cannot use AI to monitor citizens, right? That's forbidden. So let's just be mindful of that. Of course, this is going to be a problem in China, but we'll see. I talked a little bit about data privacy. This is something that's been largely solved, but companies need to be mindful that, when employees use the public model, all the data that they put in there is training a public model, right? So that data is going to a public domain. And last, what's happening today here in Colombia, right? So when we think about the regulatory evolution here, we're seeing countries react, right, to generative AI, and how do they encourage experimentation in a safe manner, right? So we can see, like over the last many years, initial discussion documents, initial proposals for law. How do we think about the 5 principles of safe development of this technology? This technology will for sure have an impact on society, will for sure have an impact on work. So how can companies respond accordingly? Many countries, by the way, are developing their own models, right? So having an advantage in building your own model, building expertise in country is going to be a competitive advantage for countries. There's a race now, I mean, mostly US and China, but we also see France playing in this. We see a lot of the Middle Eastern countries like United Arab Emirates developed the Falcon model, which is one of the best open source models that we see in the market, right? So here in Colombia, the focus is how do we think about experimentation? How do we think about building that sandbox that allows developers to build models and launch these models in a safe way across enterprises? What is the roadmap for AI adoption, right? So how do we think about platform building? How do we think about implications on data? How do we think about implications on the citizen? How do we think about adoption, right? So the government is being very thoughtful about that. So much more to see that we're going to see in the coming years. So anyway, I think my time is up, but hopefully it gave you a little bit of a glimpse. This presentation hopefully gave you a little bit of a glimpse on where AI is at today, where it's going across sectors of the economy. One of the things that I like to leave you with is, AI is already all around us, if you think about it, right? It's already in the maps we use in Google Maps, so he knows where we are. It's in our email, so he knows what we're writing. It's in social media, so he knows who our friends are and who we're connecting with and the things we like or don't like. It's already going to be in medicine, right? So just think about it. AI is not something that we're going to see 5 years. It's something that's here today. And in the next 5 years, it's not the only thing that's evolving, right? So I had the privilege of having lunch with Ignacio, who talked a lot about urban development, but also talked a lot about technology evolution. And one of the things he said that I believe a lot is the confluence of technologies getting together in the future. So for example, AI is evolving, and we're going to see models that are enormous in the next 5 years, but also robots are evolving. And also epigenetics is evolving, gene therapy is evolving, electrical vehicles are evolving, autonomous driving vehicles are evolving. Ignacio even talked about drones evolving as well. And one of the things that we're starting to see companies like NVIDIA is to converge some of these technologies, right? NVIDIA is thinking about robots and AI together, right? So in the next 5 years, we're going to see the confluence and the union of these technologies. And then once that happens, this will become much more powerful. So anyway. Thank you.